It began in silence, no shouts of triumph, no bells ringing, no cheering crowds to greet the birth of an emperor. In a cold corner of the Russian Empire, beneath heavy skies and cloaked in a winter fog, a boy was born to rule but not to live. His name was Ivan, but soon, even that would be forbidden. Ivan VI, the forgotten boy king of Russia, entered the world on August 23, 1740, wrapped in nobility and drenched in danger. He was only 2 months old when fate, politics, and the ambitions of adults carved his name into the imperial throne. And then, just as quickly, erased it. What followed was not the life of a monarch but a long, slow descent into silence, shadows, and solitude. His story is not one of reign, conquest, or glory. It is a tale of stillness, a tale of waiting, and of a child whose only crime was being born into power. Russia in the mid-18th century was a land of fragile dynasties and lethal ambition. The Romanovs had ruled for over a century, but succession was always a battlefield. Ivan's mother, Anna Leopoldovna, was niece to the Empress Anna of Russia. When the Empress lay dying without a direct heir, she named the infant Ivan as her successor. It was a decision that would seal his fate. At just 8 weeks old, Ivan VI was declared Emperor of all Russia. The regency was placed in the hands of his great-uncle, Duke Ernst Johann of Brunswick. But empires are not kind to infants. The throne is no cradle, and behind every throne in Russia stood a knife for several. In less than a year, a coup erupted. In the dead of night in December 1741, the guards of the Winter Palace turned. Led by a young and charismatic Elizabeth Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great, the court was seized. Ivan, still a baby, was taken from his mother's arms. Elizabeth ascended to the throne. From that moment, Ivan was no longer a person. He was a threat, and so he vanished. He was moved from fortress to fortress, like a ghost locked away, kept in silence. No portraits were allowed. His name could not be spoken. It was as if he had never existed. First, he was taken to Dunamund, then to the fortress at Riga, and finally to the remote and frozen Schlüsselburg fortress, where the walls were thick, the air damp, and the silence total. There, deep in the fortress, Ivan was given a single room, no windows, no human contact beyond his jailers, no books, no voice but his own. He was for years old. As years passed, the boy in the dark began to disappear, not physically, but in spirit. The human mind is not built for silence. The soul withers without the sun. Ivan spoke to himself, to the stone walls, to the cracks in the ceiling. His world was one room, and within it, he grew awkwardly, painfully, and in total isolation. Outside, history moved on. Elizabeth reigned for 2 decades. After her, Peter III took the throne, and then his wife Catherine the Great seized it for herself. Empires shifted, wars ignited, palaces rose and fell. But inside Schlüsselburg, the boy emperor remained, a relic of a forgotten coup, a prisoner of history. He was not taught, not permitted to read. His guards were forbidden to speak to him. Every attempt he made to reach out to the world was met with silence, yet he endured. He did not break. Occasionally, he scribbled notes and prayers on scraps of cloth or walls. He asked the guards for paper, for books, for mercy. But none came. Then came the whispers. The rumors of his survival had not faded. In the distant corners of Russia, the people spoke of a hidden Tsar, a rightful heir buried in stone. The idea was dangerous. The very knowledge of Ivan's existence was a threat to the Empress, and so, new orders were given. In 1764, Ivan was 23, a young man in body, but a boy in mind. The solitude had left its mark. But he was still aware. He understood who he was. He remembered that year an ambitious lieutenant named Vasily Mirovich was stationed at Schlüsselburg. He was not told the prisoner's name, but whispers reached him. And when he learned the truth, he decided to act. On the night of July 5th, he attempted to free Ivan. The plan was simple: seize the fortress, release the prisoner, and declare the true emperor returned. But behind the door of Ivan's cell stood 2 men with a different order: Catherine the Great, Fearful that Ivan might one day be used against her, had issued a secret command: if ever an attempt was made to release the prisoner, he must be killed immediately. When the guards heard the alarm, they entered the cell. They did not speak. They drew their weapons. Ivan, unarmed, untrained, and unaware, was stabbed to death in the dark. No trial. No last words, no funeral, just a quiet killing. A life ended as it had begun. In silence, his body was buried somewhere within the fortress, his grave unmarked. The official statement said a dangerous prisoner had died resisting an escape attempt. The name Ivan was not mentioned. And so ended the story of Ivan VI, not as a ruler, not even as a man, but as a memory blurred, faded, and forbidden. But within the stone walls of Schlüsselburg, a trace of him remained. Scratches on the walls, prayers etched in wood, faint signs that a life had existed there, a boy, a king, a prisoner. The story of Ivan VI is not one that history tells often. He left no decrees, no children, no victories. Only a question: what is the cost of being born into power when power itself has no mercy? In the silence of his cell, perhaps Ivan whispered the answer. We will never know what he dreamed, or if he dreamed at all. But once, in the vast empire of Russia, there was a boy king, and they locked him in the dark. Forever. They changed his name, not just on paper, but in the mouths of men, and the laws of the empire, and even in the hushed whispers of those who dared to remember. Ivan VI was no longer spoken aloud in Russia. His portraits were taken down, his name scrubbed from official documents, and his existence slowly dissolved into a cloud of dangerous myth. To speak of him was treason. To ask where he had gone was to risk exile or worse. And so, within months of being taken from the throne, Ivan was swallowed by silence. The empire moved on. The court, the nobility, the church all adjusted their loyalties as they always had in Russia's cruel and shifting politics. Empress Elizabeth, the new ruler and daughter of Peter the Great, played the role of a benevolent monarch. She painted herself as a protector of the people, bringing a divine right to the throne. But behind the grand halls and public appearances, behind the splendor of her coronation, there remained a secret no one dared disturb. Ivan. He was no longer a boy in the eyes of the world, because in the eyes of the world, he no longer existed. And yet, in a distant cell, tucked away in the farthest reaches of the empire, he continued to grow alone. They moved him often in the early years, trying to prevent any discovery, any rescue attempt. He was sent first to the fortress of Dunamund, then to Kolmogorye, a bleak and wind-lashed post on the White Sea. By the time he was a child of 7, he had already spent years in confinement, kept away from sunlight, from speech, from affection. He never saw his parents again. His mother, once ambitious and proud, was imprisoned in a convent. She wrote letters begging for her son. She pleaded for mercy, for news, anything, but no answers came. Like her son, she had become a ghost within her own country. By the time Ivan was 10, he had not heard his own name spoken in years. The guards were forbidden from talking to him. The few attendants allowed near him were instructed to give him no information, no comfort, no books, no letters. He was to be kept in a condition of total isolation, physical, intellectual, and emotional. The mind, they say, can adapt to anything. But what happens to a mind that is raised in silence? He forgot how to speak. Without language, his thoughts unraveled into instinct. Without company, his sense of self began to blur. He didn't know the world had changed outside his walls. He didn't know there had been wars, alliances, revolutions of culture. Time, to Ivan, became a series of shadows. Days began and ended, not with the sun, but with the arrival of food through a small, locked hatch in the door. He would grow accustomed to the sounds of locks turning, the shuffling of boots, the clang of metal. Those sounds became his only connection to something human. At 14, Ivan was transferred again, this time to the fortress of Schlüsselburg, a grim island prison in the river Never. Here, the walls were colder, thicker, darker. This was not a prison designed for men, it was a prison designed for forgetting. They called him simply the Nameless. 1. He was kept in a windowless cell deep within the fortress, under orders of absolute secrecy. No light, no visitors, no voice was to reach him. The few guards who knew of him were handpicked and rotated constantly to prevent familiarity. His meals were plain, his clothes rough and identical. He was not beaten nor tortured in the traditional sense, but he was broken all the same, solitary. Confinement is not a passive sentence, it is slow erosion. The body weakens, but the mind withers. There were days when Ivan would pace in circles for hours, his bare feet tracing patterns into the stone. Other days, he sat still in the corner, staring at the wall until his legs forgot how to stand. He began to murmur to himself, not with words, but with sounds, whimpers, fragments, half-remembered syllables from a language he'd once known. The guards grew uneasy around him. They whispered that he saw things in the dark, that he would sometimes laugh without reason or cry for hours into the stone. There were even rumors, impossible to verify, that he began to talk to shadows, assigning them names, speaking to them in the voice of a child long gone. He was not insane in the traditional sense, but something in him had unraveled. He had become a man who had never lived in the world, a man whose only companions were echoes. By the time he was 20, Ivan had become a myth inside the fortress itself. New guards didn't believe the stories. They thought the warnings were exaggerations meant to frighten them, until they saw the cell, until they saw the pale, silent figure inside, a tall man with the eyes of a frightened child, a man whose voice cracked like old wood, whose skin barely remembered the touch of the sun. But despite everything, there remained something in Ivan that refused to disappear. He had not gone mad. Not entirely. Somewhere, deep within, a flicker remained. He still understood in his own way that he had once been someone. A king, perhaps, or something like it. He didn't know the details anymore. He didn't remember the coronation, the brief days of rule, but he knew he had been taken, that something had been stolen, and that the silence he lived in was not natural, it was imposed. And then, in the final years of his life, the silence began to break. A new empress ruled Russia, now Catherine II, known to history as Catherine the Great. She had seized power in a bloodless coup, dethroning her own husband. Her reign was strong, visionary, modernizing. But shadows still clung to the corners of her empire. One of those shadows was Ivan. There were rumors that a foreign force, perhaps from Prussia, perhaps from within Russia itself, was planning to use Ivan as a symbol. They would free him, parade him through the streets, and claim legitimacy through his blood. Whether or not these rumors were true didn't matter. They were enough to ignite fear. Catherine issued a secret order. If ever an attempt was made to free the prisoner in Schlüsselburg, he was not to be rescued. He was not to be moved. He was to be killed. That order lay dormant for years, but the fortress guards were trained to remember it. And then, one night in July of 1764, the silence shattered. A young lieutenant named Vasily Mirovich, acting on vague promises from conspirators, attempted a prison break. He believed Ivan was a rightful ruler, a living martyr of tyranny. He thought he would be freeing a wise young man, someone who could rally the nation. He had never seen Ivan. He did not know what he would find. Mirovich stormed the fortress with a handful of loyal men. They reached the cell. They demanded the prisoner. The guards did not hesitate. They followed their orders, written years before. Mirovich could open the final door. Ivan was dead. 3 guards entered the cell and stabbed him to death with bayonets. They said he didn't resist. He didn't speak. He simply looked at them as they approached, his eyes wide, his body thin, trembling not with fear, but with something else. Some say he smiled, as if welcoming the end. The guards reported the incident within hours. Mirovich was arrested and executed days later. The empress made no public statement about Ivan's death. Officially, he had never existed. Unofficially, his murder was the closing act in a play that had begun 23 years earlier. A child crowned emperor, a boy raised by fear, a man buried in silence, and though he never ruled, never fought, never spoke to the people he was meant to lead. Ivan VI became something else, something strange and tragic and eternal, a symbol of the cost of power, of the cruelty that kings and queens will summon to protect their thrones. And even now, in the ruins of Schlesselburg Fortress, they say you can feel it. In the stones, in the wind, in the cold halls where his footsteps once echoed, a presence not loud, not angry, but quiet. The quiet of a life unlived, of a name forgotten by force, of a voice that never got to speak, and there remains one final silence. A question history cannot answer. Who was Ivan VI? A boy? Who might have ruled, or a soul that was locked away before it ever had the chance? The story of Ivan VI ends not with a throne or a crown, but with a whisper lost in the cold winds that sweep across the lonely fortress island. In death, as in life, he remained a shadow, an echo of a future stolen before it ever arrived. For decades, the Russian Empire buried him deeper than stone walls and secrets. No grand tomb was built, no monuments commemorated the boy who was emperor for less than a year. His grave lies unmarked, somewhere within the dark depths of Schlesselburg, where moss grows thick and silence is eternal. Historians have pieced together fragments of his life, letters, decrees, rumors, but these offer only faint outlines. They can tell us where he was held, how he was guarded, and how he died, but they cannot tell us who he was, or what it felt like to live in complete darkness for so many years. It is impossible to truly imagine the loneliness of a child growing up in solitary confinement, the isolation so profound it dissolves identity. To spend day after day, year after year, with no one to hold your hand, no voice to answer yours, no light to warm your skin, a life measured only by the turning of invisible clocks. Some have suggested Ivan lost his mind to madness. Others believe he simply became numb, a ghost of a person trapped between life and death. And yet, for all the years locked away, he survived, a quiet testament to human endurance in the face of utter desolation. What does his story tell us about power? About history's forgotten victims? Perhaps it is a warning that sometimes the greatest cruelty lies not in war or conquest, but in erasing a person's very existence. To strip a child of his name, his family, his future, and leave him to vanish in darkness. In the grand halls of the Kremlin, where portraits of mighty tsars and empresses hang proudly, Ivan VI's place remains empty. His face was banned, his name forbidden, and his story relegated to footnotes and whispers. Yet, his life is a haunting reminder of the fragility of power and the hidden cost of political ambition. He was a king who never ruled, a prisoner who never saw freedom, a boy whose entire world was for cold stone walls. His life was stolen before it could begin, his voice silenced before it could be heard, and now, centuries later, as the wind howls across the island fortress and the stars shine coldly above, the question lingers in the silence: what became of the forgotten boy king? Perhaps in that endless darkness, Ivan VI finally found the peace that was denied to him in life. Or perhaps in the deepest shadows of history, his spirit still waits, waiting for a world to remember the boy who was locked away and lost, the forgotten boy king. The silent prisoner, the child emperor who vanished into the dark. His story may have been hidden, his name erased, but in the quiet spaces between history's grand tales, Ivan's life echoes still, a ghostly reminder that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones history tries to forget.